My girlfriend, Julia, and I were super excited when we found the apartment. It was in an old building from the 50s, but the owners had renovated everything, giving it this charming mix of vintage and modern. It was our first time living together, and it seemed perfect, spacious, with an open kitchen and a balcony that overlooked a tree-lined street. The only weird thing was what the realtor called the locked closet in the guest room. He explained it was a storage space used by the building management, and we weren't allowed to mess with it. We didn't think much of it at the time. After all, the apartment was amazing, and the rent was affordable. That first night, while we were unpacking boxes, I noticed something odd. The hallway leading to the bedrooms looked a bit different than we remembered from the tour. Julia mentioned something similar, but we chalked it up to fatigue or the lighting. We went to bed late, exhausted. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a muffled noise. It was rhythmic, like something being dragged across the floor, coming from right next to the locked closet. I got up to check, but the hallway was totally silent, and the noise had stopped. When I got back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew it was irrational. I decided to ignore it and go back to sleep. But the unease stayed with me. The next day, while Julia was organizing the kitchen, I decided to take a closer look at the door to the locked closet. It was a regular door, but the latch seemed old, with scratch marks around it, like someone had tried to force it open several times. I pressed my ear against the wood and knocked lightly, expecting to hear the echo of an empty space, but all I felt was this heavy, suffocating silence. Like something was muffling the sound on the other side. Julia caught me in the act and laughed, saying I was being way too paranoid and that the noise the night before was probably just the building settling. I tried to brush it off, but that feeling of discomfort wouldn't leave my mind. Things started getting weirder on the third day. We found the living room door, which we always left open for airflow, closed when we came back from a walk. Julia thought it could have been the wind, but the whole building had storm shutters on the windows, so it didn't make sense. Later, while we were cooking, I heard a sound like a click coming from the hallway. I rushed to check, and this time, I was sure the doorknob of the locked closet had moved. It was turned slightly downward, like someone had just tried to open it. I stared at it, waiting for any movement, but nothing happened. Julia thought I was imagining things and suggested we call the building management to check it out. I agreed, but something told me their answer wouldn't fix whatever was going on there. The next day, I called the building management. The janitor, an older guy named Albert, showed up in the late afternoon. He had that look of someone who's seen it all and seemed more bored than concerned about our complaint. When I mentioned the noises and the door to the closet, he shrugged and said it was impossible for anyone to get in there. According to him, the key to that door had been lost years ago, and no one had access to the space since then. He even joked with a nervous smile, saying, "There's nothing in there, just some old boxes and junk." But as he spoke, his eyes kept darting to the door, like he was trying to avoid looking at it for too long. That made me even more uneasy. That night, I went to bed with the feeling that something was off. And in the middle of the night, I woke up again, but this time not because of a noise. The air in the room felt strange, heavy, like something invisible was filling the space. Julia was fast asleep next to me, but I could feel my heart racing for no apparent reason. Then, I heard it, 3 firm, dry knocks coming from the locked door. I jumped out of bed, and when I opened the bedroom door, the hallway was darker than it should have been. The motion sensor light, which always turned on automatically, was off. I stood frozen in the doorway, my whole body covered in goosebumps, and that's when I saw it. The doorknob to the closet turned slowly to the side, then snapped back to its original position with a sound that echoed in the silence. After what I saw, I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting on the couch with the lights on in the living room. Julia thought I was overreacting when I told her what happened, but maybe to calm me down, she suggested we push a dresser up against the closet door. We did that in the early afternoon, and I have to admit, I felt a little more at ease. But when we got back from the store that night, the hallway was different. The dresser we had pushed was still in place, but it was turned at a weird angle, like it had been dragged and then shoved back in place haphazardly. That was impossible. The apartment had been locked, and we were the only ones with keys. Julia finally started to get scared, though she tried to hide it. Maybe it was the janitor, she said, but the uncertainty in her voice was clear. That same night, the noises came back, but now they were louder, closer. I heard footsteps in the hallway and a continuous sound, like something scraping against the floor. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen. I know it sounds over the top, but the sense of danger felt real. While Julia stayed in the bedroom, I slowly crept toward the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the closet door, the noise suddenly stopped. I couldn't hear anything but my own labored breathing. Then, for the first time, I sensed something different, a strange, almost metallic smell, like it was coming from inside the closet. I stood there for minutes, holding the knife tightly, before finally deciding to go back to the bedroom. But before I left, I heard a low, muffled laugh, like someone was right on the other side. After that laugh, the situation became unbearable. I stayed up all night, thinking through all the possibilities. Could someone really have access to the apartment? Or worse, had someone been hiding inside the whole time? The next day, I called the building manager and insisted the door be opened. He seemed reluctant, but eventually agreed to come with a locksmith in the afternoon. When the locksmith arrived, I noticed he seemed nervous. While fiddling with the latch, he muttered something about old buildings always causing problems and avoided looking me in the eye. After a few minutes of work, he finally managed to open the door. What we saw inside made me step back immediately. The space was much larger than we'd imagined, almost like a whole room. But what caught our attention the most were the marks on the floor, deep scratches, like something heavy had been dragged over and over again. In the corner of the room, there was a small pile of things that didn't belong to us: children's clothes, an old doll missing an eye, and something that looked like a dusty journal. Julia went pale and ran out of the apartment. The building manager, visibly uncomfortable, said he'd never been inside and had no idea how those items ended up in the closet. I knew he was lying, his eyes told me everything. But before I could confront him, he hurried out, saying he'd take care of it later. After the building manager left, Julia insisted we spend the night at a hotel. I didn't need much convincing. The idea of sleeping in that apartment after what we had seen was terrifying. I grabbed the journal we found, more out of curiosity than anything else, and took it with me. At the hotel, while Julia was in the shower, I started flipping through the pages. The first ones were hard to make out, written in sloppy handwriting with lots of mistakes, like they were from a child. But as I went on, the entries became clearer and more disturbing. Someone was describing, in detail, the daily routines of the building's previous tenants. Trivial things, like their leaving times, visitors, and even what they ate. But the most disturbing part was that the entries didn't stop in the past. The last pages described things Julia and I had done that week. My blood ran cold. Someone was watching us. Someone knew every little detail of our lives in that apartment. I couldn't sleep that night, and neither could Julia when I showed her the journal. The next day, we decided we wouldn't go back to that place. We hired a company to pick up our things and made it clear we didn't want to step foot in that apartment again. Sometime later, I got a message from the building manager saying the space had been sealed for good, and no one would have access to it again. But something about the way he wrote that didn't sit right with me. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that locked closet, but one thing I'm sure of: something or someone was in there, watching us, and it wasn't something I ever wanted to find out.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
It was early December when I decided to rent out the basement of my house. My name's Marianne, I'm 34, and I've been living alone since my divorce at the beginning of the year. Back then, I was trying to get my finances back on track, and the idea of having a tenant seemed like the perfect solution. My house is pretty big, and the basement had been recently renovated, with its own entrance, so it made sense to make use of the space. The tenant who showed up, Mark, seemed ideal. A guy in his early 40s, laid back, polite, and he worked as a remote programmer. He told me he needed a quiet place to focus on his work. I didn't see anything wrong with him. In fact, he was so quiet that we barely exchanged words after he moved in. It seemed too good to be true. At first, everything was just as it seemed. Calm. I almost forgot someone was living downstairs. But a few weeks later, things started to change. First, there were small things that I thought were my fault. A cup I was sure I had left in the cabinet would show up in the sink. The key to my car, which I always left on the little table by the door, would sometimes be gone. I figured I was just getting disorganized. I was busy with work, and the holidays were coming up, so I blamed it on my tired mind. But one Saturday night, something happened that really unsettled me. While I was watching TV, I heard a noise coming from downstairs. It wasn't like Mark was playing music or watching something loud. It was the sound of footsteps in my hallway. I froze for a few seconds, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. My house is old, so there are always noises. Wood creaking, the wind blowing through cracks. But this was different. The footsteps were light, almost deliberate, as if someone was trying not to be noticed. I slowly stood up from the couch, holding my phone in my hand, ready to call the police if necessary. I called out Mark's name, trying to sound casual. "Mark, is that you up there?" No response. I walked down the hallway, my heart racing, and looked toward my bedroom. The door was slightly open, something I never left. Everything seemed in order, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. The next morning, I went down to the basement with some excuse to talk to Mark. He opened the door, looking half asleep, with an expression that made me uncomfortable. His eyes were small and deep-set, and he had a smile that didn't quite match the situation. I asked if he'd heard any noise the night before, and he denied it, saying it was probably just the sounds of the old house. He even joked, mentioning that he sometimes heard the same noises when he worked late into the night. I tried to smile, but something about that interaction left me uneasy. It was like he was trying to read my reactions, analyzing every word I said. I went back upstairs, determined to pay closer attention to what was going on. In the following days, I started to be more vigilant. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but something inside me knew something was off. I decided to try something. I put a small piece of tape on the doorframe of my pantry, discreetly, almost invisible. It was a door I rarely used, so if anyone messed with it, I'd know. To my surprise, the next night, when I checked, the tape was shifted. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe I'd done it by accident, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I decided to check everything before bed. I closed all the doors, locked the windows, and left a few lights on, trying to make my house less inviting to any unwanted visitors. That same night, I woke up with a strange feeling, like I was being watched. It was that kind of discomfort you can't ignore, even when you try to convince yourself it's just your imagination. I looked at the clock. 3:27 a.m. The silence of the house felt heavier than ever. As I got up to grab a glass of water, I walked through the hallway and saw something that froze me to the bone. The basement light was on. I remembered Mark had said he worked late, but there was something unsettling about that light coming from under the door, almost like it was calling me to check it out. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but the mix of curiosity and fear won out. I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs. Each step felt higher than the last, as if the stairs would never end. When I reached the bottom, I hesitated before knocking on the basement door. I called Mark's name softly, but there was no answer. The light was still seeping through the cracks, and the door wasn't fully closed. With the flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, I slowly pushed the door open. The space was eerily quiet, but something was off. His desk was a mess, papers scattered around, and the monitor was on, showing a black screen. It didn't look like he was there. I took a few more steps and noticed a strange smell, something metallic, like rust mixed with mold. As I turned to leave, I noticed something that made me freeze. An old, rickety wooden ladder leading up to an opening in the ceiling. This opening led directly into my closet, in my bedroom. My mind started putting the pieces together. The feeling of being watched, the misplaced objects, the noise in the hallway. My heart was racing. I grabbed my phone, and instead of calling the police right away, I decided to check my bedroom. I ran up the stairs, ignoring any noise I might have made. When I opened my bedroom door, my eyes went straight to the closet. It was slightly open, something I never left. Shaking, I opened the doors all the way. At the back, behind my clothes, there was a pile of small objects I didn't recognize. An old hairbrush, a notebook that wasn't mine, and worst of all, photos of me. Photos taken from angles I didn't know were even possible inside my house. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just an invasion of privacy. It was something deeper, more twisted. My mind screamed at me to get out of there, but my legs felt glued to the floor. I looked again at the photos. Some were old, clearly taken before Mark even moved in. Others, however, were recent, showing moments when I was on the couch, in the kitchen, or even sleeping. A chill ran down my spine. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, explaining what was happening while I locked every door I could between the basement and my part of the house. My biggest fear at that moment was that Mark might come up the makeshift ladder in the closet. The police arrived quickly, but those minutes of waiting were the longest of my life. When they entered the basement, Mark wasn't there. The makeshift ladder had also disappeared. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. However, as they searched the space, the officers found a small hidden entrance behind a bookshelf. It led to a narrow tunnel, filled with items that seemed to belong to previous residents, or maybe even Mark's victims. There was also a kind of journal where he had written notes about me, detailing my routines, what I did, and even what I wore. They said it was more than enough for an arrest warrant. Even with the police assuring me that they were investigating and would be searching for Mark, I could no longer feel at peace in my own home. I spent that night at a friend's house, trying to process everything that had happened. What scared me the most was thinking about how long this had been going on without me realizing. Mark hadn't just been inside my house. He knew my habits better than I did. The thought that he might have been watching, maybe even planning something worse, made me tremble with fear. The police recommended I change the locks and install cameras, but I knew that wouldn't be enough to erase the feeling of invasion. In the days that followed, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I put the house up for sale and moved into a smaller apartment in a building with security. Even after all of this, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling of being watched. No matter how much they try to reassure me, saying he probably fled far away, I never knew what happened to Mark. To this day, I still wonder how someone so discreet could hide something so disturbing. More than fear, what remained was a mental scar, the certainty that we never truly know the people we let into our lives.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I live in a big city, in an apartment that's barely big enough for me and all the stuff I've accumulated over the years. Early last year, I decided I needed more space, not just in my apartment, but in my life. So, I rented a storage unit at one of those places that's open 24/7. It seemed like a practical, cheap, and most importantly, safe solution. I picked a small unit, but enough to store boxes of old documents, winter clothes I never wore, and a few childhood keepsakes. Back then, I was working as a freelance graphic designer from home, so the idea of having less clutter around seemed perfect. I'd visit the storage unit every now and then, always during the day, and never had any issues. But one specific night, I needed to grab an old photo album of my mom's that was stored there. I had the last-minute idea to give it as a gift, and I thought it wouldn't hurt to swing by before heading to bed. I got to the storage place just after 11 p.m. The place felt even more desolate at night, with that long hallway lit by flickering fluorescent lights. You know that kind of silence that's so deep, it almost hums in your ears? That was exactly what it was like. When I opened the door to my unit, I froze. Instead of my awkwardly stacked boxes, I found shelves set up, filled with stuff I'd never seen before. There was an old typewriter, spotless, books with worn covers in languages I didn't understand, and a row of porcelain dolls, all with fixed stares that seemed to follow every movement. I shut the door instantly, like I thought closing it would erase what I'd seen. My first thought was that the storage place must have switched the locks. Maybe they'd given my unit to someone else by mistake. But when I looked at the number on the door, my stomach dropped. It was definitely my unit. I stood there in the hallway, trying to process what I'd just seen. Logic told me it must have been some kind of administrative mistake. Maybe someone had accessed my unit by accident, or used a master key to store their stuff. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. The storage place always seemed organized, and the security was tight. At least, that's what the contract said. I worked up the courage to open the door again and take a closer look. Inside, everything was meticulously arranged, like whoever had done it spent hours organizing. On top of one of the shelves, there was a small wooden box with a note pinned to it. My hand shook as I picked up the note. It was written in fine, slanted handwriting. I like your choice of place. Now, this is mine too. I went back to my apartment that night with a heavy feeling in my chest. I locked the door with 3 turns of the key and sat in the living room, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't take anything from the storage unit, not even the note. Part of me wanted to believe it was just some twisted prank, but another part, the part that kept me awake all night, knew it wasn't. The next morning, I called the storage place. They were polite, but not helpful. They told me I was the only one with access to my unit, and their system didn't show any recent entries other than mine. They insisted I come by to check in person. But just thinking about going back to that cold, creepy hallway sent chills down my spine. I wanted to forget what I saw, but something told me that story was far from over. I tried to go on with my routine as if nothing had happened, but the feeling of being watched started to haunt me. Over the next few days, I noticed small things in my apartment that seemed out of place. A book I was sure I'd left on the shelf appeared on the living room table. My coat, which I always hung behind the door, was thrown on the couch one morning. I thought I might just be distracted, but it kept happening more and more often. One night, when I got back from the store, I found a new note under my apartment door. It was folded into 4 parts, and the message was straightforward. Thanks for sharing your space with me. Hope you like the changes. The handwriting was the same as the one on the note at the storage unit. My heart raced. How did this person know where I lived? After that, I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Every noise in the hallway, every creak of the floorboards made me freeze. I started avoiding going out at night and changed the locks, but it didn't seem to make a difference. One night, I woke up with the feeling that someone was in my room. The streetlight outside partially lit the room, and I swear I saw a shadow move near the window. I jumped out of bed and turned on the light, but there was no one there. The window locks were intact, and I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Even so, I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room with all the lights on. It felt like that presence, whoever or whatever it was toying with me, testing my limits. Things reached an unbearable point. I didn't feel safe even in my own apartment anymore. Every day became harder to endure. So, one sleepless night, I decided to go back to the storage unit. I needed answers. I grabbed my flashlight and went there just after midnight, when the building would be completely empty. The hallway felt even colder and more oppressive than the last time. I opened my unit's door slowly, expecting to find the same strange scene, but what I saw froze me to the bone. The shelves were still there, but now there was a chair in the center of the space, facing the door. On it, a porcelain doll unlike the others, with an unnervingly wide smile painted on its face. In the doll's lap was a sealed envelope with my name on it. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. The message said, "We enjoy seeing you here. Maybe it's your turn to visit us." There was no signature, no clues as to who might have left it. I left the storage unit without looking back, but the fear didn't stay there. On my way home, I had the feeling that someone was following me. The sound of footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, stopping every time I turned around. When I finally got to the apartment, I locked the door and stood there in the dark for a few minutes, trying to hear anything. The silence was almost as oppressive as the noise before. And then, to my horror, I realized something was wrong. On the living room table, where I never left anything, there was a new porcelain doll, identical to the one in the storage unit. That doll on my table was the breaking point. It was impossible to ignore. Someone had been in my apartment while I was gone. I grabbed it with a cloth, avoiding touching it directly, and put it in the trash bag. My instinct was to call the police. But what would I say? That a doll appeared out of nowhere and I felt like I was being stalked. Without concrete evidence, it would just sound like madness. I spent the next day in a constant state of alert, analyzing every sound, every shadow. As the sun started to set, I decided I needed a plan. I searched the apartment for anything that could help me. That's when I noticed something strange in the hallway closet. One of the backboards was loose. I pulled carefully, and behind it, I found a small hidden space. Inside that space, there were things that didn't belong to me. Old photos of people I didn't recognize, a rusty key, and at the back, a black notebook. I opened the notebook with trembling fingers. It was filled with notes written in tiny, rushed handwriting, as if the person had written quickly or in a state of panic. There were detailed descriptions of every room in my apartment, accompanied by dates and times. My stomach churned when I saw that some of the notes were recent, describing exactly what I'd been doing over the past few days. Today he changed the locks. Useless, one entry read. Another, dated just the night before, said, he went back to the storage unit. I like how he tries to resist. My head started spinning. Whoever this was, not only had they been in my home, but they had been watching me the whole time. In that moment, I realized I couldn't stay there anymore. I grabbed the notebook and ran out of the apartment, taking nothing but the clothes on my back and my phone. I stayed at a cheap hotel that night, trying to convince myself that I was safe for now. I spent hours rereading the notebook, trying to find clues. Among the notes about me, there were disconnected fragments that seemed like delusional ramblings. They're everywhere. The space is ours. It always has been. And the visitor must stay. The more I read, the more I became convinced that this was something bigger than just a regular stalker. Around 3 a.m., I received a message on my phone. It was from an unknown number, with only one sentence. Come back home. We'll wait. The next day, I made a decision that seemed inevitable. I went straight to the police station and handed over the notebook. I explained the situation, leaving out some details that might sound too crazy, but the officers seemed skeptical. One of them mentioned that, without proof of a break-in or a direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. Still, they agreed to send a squad car to investigate my apartment. I waited in the lobby, biting my nails and trying to stay calm. When the officers came back, their expressions were enough to make me freeze. The apartment is empty, they said. No furniture, no clothes, no signs anyone ever lived there. Are you sure this is the address? I left the station unable to process what was happening. How could my apartment be empty? I went there hoping the officers had made some kind of mistake. But when I opened the door, reality hit me. The place was completely vacant. Not even the marks from furniture on the floor or the faded paint on the walls were there. It was as if years of living in that space had been erased. I rushed to the storage unit, hoping to find at least a clue. When I arrived, the hallway felt even longer and quieter than before. My unit was open, but empty. The shelves, the dolls, even my own things were gone. The only thing in the middle of the floor was the same porcelain doll with the wide smile, holding one last note. It read, "You're part of this now." It's been a year since everything happened. After that night, I couldn't stay in the city anymore. I moved to another state, changed my number, and now I live in constant paranoia. Sometimes I think I see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye or find things out of place, even here. I've never received another note or message, but the feeling of being watched has never gone away. The police never found anything in my old apartment or the storage unit, and I still don't know who, or what, was stalking me. I don't know what it means to be part of this, but sometimes I wake up at night with the certainty that I will find out. And when that day comes, I fear there will be nothing I can do to escape.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.